Hello, welcome. My name is Christine Perret. I'm the Executive Director of the AR for Enterprise Alliance, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. This is being recorded, so of course the webinar will be available as an archive on YouTube as well as from the area website. Just to remind those of you who are joining as attendees, you are on mute. If you would like to ask questions of myself or the panelists, you can use the GoToWebinar questions segment area, the console, as part of the GoToWebinar control panel. So this webinar is one of a series. The area is informing people and providing high quality vendor neutral content. We introduced ourselves back in the first webinar last fall. We've also had our customer members join us to speak about why they've introduced augmented reality. We've had discussions on other topics over the last few months. And so this is part of an ongoing series, and I do hope that you'll return for other episodes in the future. Today's webinar is going to be on the topic of forecasting the growth of this industry. We want to gain insights into the trends that impact this growth and how these trends are captured by analysts, and to hear from two leading analysts how and how quickly they believe enterprise AR will expand, how do they measure it, and what are they looking as important signals. Before I have the pleasure of sharing this webinar with Tom and JP Gounder, I'm going to give you a few remarks about the area, introduce you to our organization, and then we can go ahead and hear more about forecasting. So the area sees augmented reality as really a technology building upon existing technologies, adding to also places that are a little bit less technology penetrated. The workplace. Many people's workplaces, those who work in the physical world, have not had the benefit of a lot of information technology. But with new information systems and augmented reality, we can increase the relevance of information, presenting only that information which is fresh and in context to those people in the workplace. We can also help them to better use the resources, be they human resources, other natural resources or supplies, finding things that are lost, using the best tools, and so forth. And with augmented reality, sensors and cameras, we can also capture what the worker is doing and thereby capture, record, and certify that they're performing tasks according to policies and compliance. In addition, augmented reality can speed up the time to perform tasks, especially those that are rare and complex. So things that are unfamiliar or just too complicated to remember in our busy brains. By reducing the time already is one type of efficiency that can be increased. We can also, there's some new trials and certainly some research that shows that we can reduce errors because that might be caused by lack of information or information that's out of date. And then if you can reduce time to perform tasks, reduce or eliminate even errors, then it only flows from there that it reduces the costs, can lower the impacts of interruption, task interruption as well. So by combining this better access to information and other benefits, we can boost the operational efficiency of companies in the future, especially those companies that have a lot of assets in the physical world. This is really an important element of augmented reality. The area was started a few years ago, and today we are dedicating ourselves to accelerating the adoption of augmented reality in the enterprise. Our members really start with the customers, thinking about the customer needs, especially, as I mentioned, companies that have a lot of assets in the physical world, costly assets, a lot of human beings, a very large workforce is another way of multiplying the effect or multiplying the impacts of augmented reality. So the customer's needs, of course, are the starting point. The providers of technologies can then combine components, integrate systems, and overlay services on top of those to address the needs with solutions. And these technology providers come in all sizes. They're in, around the world. And between the customers and providers, we also recognize another segment of the ecosystem we call the non-commercial entities. This includes research institutes, academic, universities and research centers of that nature, other trade associations, standards organizations, all kinds of entities that might increase interoperability, increase access to workforce that's trained to performing these tasks. And we think that by having the customers, providers, and non-commercial entities working together, we will lead to better customer outcomes with the adoption of, and the introduction and the adoption of augmented reality. Our stated mission is to help organizations who are selling the technology, as well as organizations who want to integrate the technology to achieve that operational efficiency that I spoke of a few minutes ago through a smoother integration or introduction of augmented reality. So if you don't have smooth introduction, it's going to delay widespread adoption. And I believe that if you have interoperable systems, they will be better suited for integrating into our legacy management, enterprise information management systems, and many other systems, human factors and human resources, and integration, and making this part of our successful companies in the future. We are a diverse organization. We have members from around the world, Europe, North America, and Asia. As I mentioned, some of our members are very large enterprises. Some of them are large providers of technologies, as well as many small companies that are contributing innovation and new technologies. If you'd like to find out more about our organization and the area, I hope that you'll visit our website, thearea.org. Please also follow us on Twitter, and maybe you'll see us at a future event. Okay, now I'm going to turn my attention to today's webinar. We are talking about the challenges and the opportunity ahead. So, where are those opportunities? And over the past year, and especially at the beginning of this year, I've noticed there's just been a lot of new reports published about enterprise augmented reality. It's really an exciting field. And I think that people are looking for those forecasts because they need to prepare for the future and invest in the future. They want to know where they should be putting their money, but also their time. How might they train their employees differently in preparation for the introduction of augmented reality? So a lot of reasons. There are investors that also want to know where this is going and how quickly. Those investors probably are going to help productize and commercialize things that are pre-commercialization, things that are still in very preliminary or immature technologies, and takes a lot of time and effort to get them to be stable enough to rely on a daily basis and to make them part of a mission critical system. So people also need forecasts to help them set goals, such as their revenue goals, and understanding the timing when they might expect those revenues, as well as when and how they can establish strategic partnerships with other companies to to complete and to deliver a full solution to those customers. I think one of the questions that I hear about when I'm talking about the future is people want to know just how far into the future should we expect forecasts to look, and how reliable will they be? Well, that depends on the type of technology, as well as what you're going to do with that forecast. How do you expect to use it? If you're trying to predict a return on investment, that might be a different use than if you're trying to return on investment from buying enterprise augmented reality technology versus a return on investment on a venture capital or an investment in a new company. One of the companies that has followed augmented reality for quite a few years is the Gartner Group, and many of you are familiar with the Gartner Group hype cycle for emerging technologies. It's been used by many people to show trends, and they are able to show different stages of an emerging technology from the time it's just a concept, more or less, to when it's useful for people, whether they be enterprises or consumers. So there's um, a map, a kind of a cycle that they've described in a great deal of detail, and they issue an annual curve that's dotted with different technologies. And a few months ago, I was at a conference, and one of the presenters brought up this. He went all the way back to the year 2000, so 15 years of hype cycle, to show us, how sometimes this is effective, and it also can be quite difficult or unreliable as a way of predicting the future. But so he started with the year 2000. I'm not sure when Gartner started releasing these, but he didn't find 2001, so jumped on to 2002. We don't see any augmented reality here, but you're starting to see some things that are precursors, perhaps identity services. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but web services were still at the top of the hype cycle in 2002. In 2003, you can see how when you go back in time, the resolution of your graphics gets lower. We're not quite saving graphics in the same resolution we do today. But there are some precursors or some enabling technologies, perhaps in these early years, and it's only in 2004 that begin to see augmented reality appear. It's predicted to be approximately 10 or more years into the future. So this is the first time that it's recognized as a separate technology. And then 2005, it hasn't moved very much, still in the same position, but they're thinking maybe it's less than 10 years to the time. And then they've, by 2006, adjusted things back. Maybe it's there's been some new developments or a lack of new developments, and it's still very early days. They can see that it's a long ways to go. In 2007, I guess there were so many other things to focus on that augmented reality didn't get included. But in 2008, again, it appears as a long, very futuristic suite of technologies. We're not even sure really how they defined augmented reality at this stage. But here in 2009, it seems like still in the technology, the very first technology trigger, the first phase, only barely crossing and approaching the top of the inflated expectations peak. 2011, still in the period of inflated expectations, still 5 to 10 years away in 2012. And as you can see now, over 2013, In 2014, the technology is beginning to be more of a people are disillusioned and perhaps frustrated. And in July of 2015, this is the graph that was published by Gartner Group. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I want to thank Rab Scott of the AMRC with Boeing. AMRC with Boeing is a valued area member for compiling these slides and sharing those with me and with us today. So, I mean, how do we make forecasts more reliable, more realistic? Well, I'm sure that everyone has, the analyst groups have their in-house researchers. They also interview a lot of experts in the field, startups, as well as people in academia and other external resources. And then we're always, of course, monitoring the news and looking at other forecasts and reports. And as I mentioned, augmented reality is impacted by a lot of other trends, not just those technology trends, but certainly consumer electronics is providing us with some hardware that can be adapted for augmented reality. There are industry-specific trends and timing. The price of oil, for example, when it's high, there's more money for research. When it's low, there's definitely a slowing down. There are societal and policy issues, and of course, as I mentioned, financial issues. There might be other trends outside of technology that we need to pay attention to. So with those opening remarks, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Mainelli of IDC. Tom, if you'll just tell me when you want to advance, I'll go ahead and forward the slides for you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Christine. So I am the VP of Devices and AR/VR at IDC. We started looking at this technology probably a year and a half to 2 years ago. What I'm currently working on is our first worldwide hardware forecast focused on augmented reality as well as virtual reality. In fact, this week I'm sitting down with a long list of our regional analysts to get their take on specifically AR, but VR as well, in their countries and in their regions. So we'll build a worldwide view of devices, and then in the coming months, we're going to change gears and put together what we call a spending guide, which looks at all the other things, many of which Christine has alluded to today. So that's everything from software to application development to services. We'll forecast spending by vertical around all those devices. But what I wanted to talk about today, and what is close to my heart, is the devices. So Christine, if you want to move to the next slide. One of the things that I have been wrestling with as we look at this hardware market is I didn't put slides in here to discuss the difference between augmented and virtual reality because I figured everybody on this call knows the difference. But one area of challenge, I think, for the industry going forward is the shades of gray within augmented reality. And there are some players in the industry that want us to have basically 3 buckets: virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. The problem I have with mixed reality is that I'm getting a lot of feedback from within the industry that people presume that a mixed reality device is actually one that can do augmented reality and or virtual reality. So I propose that within augmented reality, we need both a basic category and an advanced category. And basic, as you can see on the slide and the image on the left, is Google Glass level of information, viewable only, but I would argue still augmenting your reality because you can see it as you go about your daily tasks or as you complete a task. Advanced is interactive objects, and the example here is from HoloLens. And so in this case, you're overlaying digital objects into your physical reality, and then you can manipulate those objects oftentimes with your hands. So that's the first thing that I'd like to put forward, is that we need to start thinking about different ways to segment the augmented reality hardware category. Christine, if you move to the next slide, please. So we are looking at three major device categories, and these run across AR and VR. Screenless viewers is the first, and frankly, right now, that's just a VR play, and a Samsung Gear VR play specifically, although we know there will be many more of these. We're going to exclude cardboard from this bucket, just because those numbers are going to be very high, and there's not a lot of tech inside of most cardboard devices. Tethered head-mounted displays, that middle category, is where a lot of the action is going to be in the near term for both VR and AR. That's effectively a head-mounted display that is tethered to a general purpose device such as a smartphone, a PC, or a gaming console. And then the final category, and where I think a lot of interest is going to be longer term, is standalone head-mounted displays. And the two examples I have here are both augmented reality, HoloLens on top, and Epson's Mufario on the bottom. The HoloLens is effectively a Windows 10 PC that's perched on your nose, and the Epson has a purpose-built connected Android computer that's not in the glasses, but is connected to it and is required for use. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move quickly through some of the key challenges we see around hardware. There are the tech challenges. So anytime you're talking about augmented reality, and particularly the advanced hardware, you're talking about products that have to capture and process a lot of inputs on the fly. So it's not just a matter of serving up information, but actually collecting information from the surroundings, from the user, etc. One of the challenges is going to be tethered versus battery, or mobile versus stationary. So I mentioned HoloLens. That's a battery-operated standalone device. A big competitor there will be Meta. Their new Meta 2 is a very interesting product that happens to be tethered to a notebook. So different use cases when you're mobile versus stationary. Right now, there's no clear leading platforms. All of the usual suspects are at play here. Microsoft pushing Windows 10, Google with Android, and of course Apple is working behind closed door on iOS. But right now, a lot of the tools that are being used to create augmented reality applications are often repurposed. Next slide, please. So we're going to run into a lot of human challenges as we try to roll this hardware out, not the least of which is things like eye strain, physical limits. Microsoft has said, one of the things that they've already found is people that are using HoloLens and interaction mode with HoloLens, where you hold your hand in front of your chest, that can be fatiguing over time. That interaction mode is pretty rudimentary as well. And then finally, from a human perspective, Christine and JP were certainly around when Google Glass first rolled out, and there were a lot of challenges there around people's perception about Google Glass. A lot of people didn't like having Google Glass stare back at them. I think we avoid a lot of those social challenges when we focus on AR in the enterprise. Next slide. And then from a business perspective, I think there are a lot of challenges, but highly surmountable. One of these is that anytime you try to introduce new hardware that is going to fundamentally change work processes, there's going to be some pushback. And so we can expect that in AR, which means there's going to need to be champions within an organization that shepherd these products and processes through proof of concept and pilot. There will be high initial cost and not a lot of tools to measure the return on investment, but frankly, I think that ROI is going to be off the charts. We just need to figure out how to measure it. And then, of course, the age-old question, are we replacing, supplementing, or are these new deployments of hardware when we're rolling them out? And Christine said it at the beginning. I think in a lot of cases we will be deploying these to workers who are using their hands all day and maybe don't have regular usage of today's PCs or mobile devices. And before I pass it over to JP, I guess the other thing I'd like to say is my presentation is focused primarily on the growth of specific hardware platforms, but I entirely believe that in the near term, augmented reality is going to be used primarily through connected smartphones and tablets. And so that's where a lot of the app development is going to be in the near term. It'll be a few years before we start to see larger and larger hardware deployments around specific AR products. And next slide. That's my contact information, and I look forward to questions. And next slide.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much, Tom. It's great to hear your perspective. JP, are you ready? Can I hear your voice?
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Tom. I'm JP Gounder, and much like Tom, I spend a lot of my time on devices, and I too am doing a great deal around AR, VR, as well as more traditional, tablets and smartphones and that sort of thing. I'll echo what Tom said, which is that in my presentation, I too have focused on the head-mounted display future, but fully recognize that today we find a lot of very interesting augmented reality applications being conducted on tablets and smartphones. In particular, you're finding that people are changing some of the same kinds of jobs that we're going to see head-mounted displays and smart glasses change down the line. So your field technician, your person who is a utilities worker, somebody who's dealing with complex installation or repair work, even in hospital settings. And I think the thing is that, as we move forward in this market, we quickly come to realize that all of those jobs are in fact benefited by hands-free. And that's why I think we have a lot of interest in smart glasses. So if you could go to the next slide, Christine. I will apologize in advance to those whom I've left off of this slide because you may be in attendance, but just a sampling here of some of the different companies that we look at. Clearly there are workforce implications. As Tom referenced, the consumer market here is very, very premature to talk about. It was recently rumored, for example, that Snapchat would be perhaps developing their own kind of smart glass for the consumer market. And we know that Magic Leap, with their $1.4 billion in funding, is probably going after that opportunity as well. We also know that HoloLens from Microsoft is currently being seen more as an enterprise play, but that they quickly expect to move into consumer. So there's definitely some crossover here. But what I think is really interesting is that if you are an enterprise, let's say you're an infrastructure buyer or a CIO, and you're thinking about actually making some purchasing decisions here, you're going to be talking to some companies that you may not be as familiar with, whether that's Aether Labs, or Meta, or Epson Moverio, or Apex Labs in the kind of software and middleware space. You're going to be talking to what are reasonably young companies. Dacry, another one that I know is in the area membership I saw in the earlier slide. All of these companies are 10 years or less old, right? They're very young companies, but they're already starting to empower some interesting scenarios. And so what I'm going to do in my remaining slides is walk through a few scenarios that help us to understand how to forecast this market. In other words, without understanding those scenarios, there's no market to really talk about. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
Whoops.
Many of, as I mentioned, these workflows require hands-free operation. Mixing some of this digital information, as Tom talked about, into real-world scenarios often requires a first-person point of view. One of the things we will hear about very frequently is this idea that somebody who's out in the field somewhere who is lacking information or needs a double check on their perspective on something can, in real time, collaborate from a first-person video perspective, and we'll see an example of that coming up. I think it's also really important to note that the Internet of Things plays a huge role here. Many different objects in the environment and pieces of machinery are becoming increasingly self-aware to the extent that they're generating machine-to-machine data about themselves. So what is my status? How long have I been in operation? Am I going to break? Am I broken? Where do you fix me? All of these kinds of information are growing, and as we sort of move through the world, we will have more and more opportunities to actually use that data in our jobs and eventually in our lives, but we need a very kind of real-time environment of notification to gain access to it. Next slide, please. So as I referenced before, this is an example of a key scenario. In this case, we don't have a field technician. We actually have someone who is in their home who's attempting to fix their sink. From the first person perspective, in this case, it's labeled dad, so we'll assume that that's her father, is able to use a flat screen device to see what she sees and then to mark it up. We see this happening in complex field operations environments right now as well, where you're really seeing a change in the way that you staff. If you have field service technicians, it used to be the case maybe you would send your most senior people out into the field because they were most experienced at being able to fix some of these complex problems that come up. In other cases now, with these kind of smart glass trials, what you're seeing is maybe the junior people are out in the field and they create a call center method where they can actually in real time get mentoring and help from somebody who's experienced. So it actually can change the cost structure and the business model of how you operate field service using these kinds of scenarios. Next slide. We referenced Epson Moverio. I like this example. This is a scanning example where they can scan the veins in your arm, and the phlebotomist, the person who takes your blood, is able to see exactly where they are sticking the needle. And this means more productivity on the part of the phlebotomist and fewer infections, which is good for the hospital. But my favorite part is it actually hurts less because they miss less often. Next slide. Athere Labs is taking some of what I just said to heart here. They're positioning a lot of their offerings here in terms of M2M, Internet of Things. This is a case where you have a machine engine, an airplane engine that's very self-aware, that knows a lot about how long it's been in service and when it was last fixed by a technician. It can even offer schematics and videos to help you to solve the problem. Next slide. And we also see some B2B2C examples. In this case, L'Oreal, through Yves Saint Laurent, has done some interesting things with Google Glass to help makeup artists capture their sessions on video from a subjective point of view, to then demonstrate application techniques. So in other words, using this as a way to change the experience. And you could imagine with something like HoloLens, it could be possible for a makeup artist at the makeup counter at a department store to literally follow a template as they apply makeup to your face. So there will be a lot of experimentation in kind of customer-facing but company-owned assets in this as well. Next slide. Finally here, Lowe's HoloRoom, which you've probably heard a bit about, they are allowing people to visualize in advance the bathroom or the kitchen renovation that they've designed for themselves. And in this case, you can see they're using a tablet, but this has also been used on Oculus Rift and on Google Cardboard. The idea here is that if I'm going to be buying this kitchen or this new bathroom, I want to have a complete visualization of it. And so augmented reality gives people a view into this, and in particular, down the line, perhaps we will see more of those mixed reality scenarios. Next, please. So I guess I would say that the way that we've taken these kinds of scenarios is we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of jobs using some government data. And in fact, I isolated 264 jobs in the economy that take advantage of skills that would be amenable to augmentation using AR smart glasses in this case. And while we have a pretty early market on the vendor side, and we know that others are going to be entering, we can sort of calibrate against what we expect in the future. So as we start to forecast this, we look at what's the total addressable market of jobs, what is the vendor timeline, and then what are these scenarios that I've just shown you, among others, that help to create ROI. All of these things feed into some of the forecasting efforts that we did for enterprise smart glasses. Next slide, please. So I want to thank you all for including me here, and I will look forward to the conversation with Christine and Tom now.
Great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Once again, if people want a reminder of our guests, Tom and JP's pictures are up here. You both touched on it, but I want to ask a more specific version of this general question of devices. Are you going to include the Google Glass recon instruments, a whole host of other similar basic AR features? Are you going to include those in your forecasts, Tom?
Sure, I'll go first. So we will. What we're wrestling with right now as an organization is we have a wearables forecast that includes eyewear, and so we're debating internally where to count certain things. It's my belief that those devices need to be captured in this forecast. I understand some pushback around how connected they are. I think in the near term, a non-connected or a device where you can interact with the information becomes it's very limited, and it's probably not going to be a lot of volume. We'll capture those at the beginning because eventually those will trickle down to consumer, but be less of an enterprise play.
Okay. But what about smartphones and tablets? What about like a Tango tablet that has depth sensing? Does that count as an AR device?
I'll go first and then let JP respond. So in our taxonomy, we would capture those devices from a shipment perspective in their own buckets. I think it's a valid question to inquire about usage scenarios and how are people going to interact with AR out of the gate. But in terms of trying to capture those devices as AR specific, I would exclude those.
Thank you.
So as we think about it here, I think you'll be noticing, if you think back to my presentation, I focused on smart glasses rather than sort of AR. In that case, clearly we're going to include the monocular versions like Vuzix, like Recon, like Google Glass, because it's part of a enterprise viewpoint on smart glasses. And we also focus very closely on the workflows. And so what we're seeing is that, let's say somebody who may have worked with Google Glass a couple of years ago in a surgical context or in a field service context, they may now be upgrading their game from monocular to binocular, in which case they're getting a more augmented reality kind of viewpoint on things. That said, they're all part and parcel, I think, of the same market. And so I agree with Tom that if you're looking at the smart glasses market, you need to include all of them, with the proviso that there is some controversy about whether Google Glass is really augmented reality or not. I think ultimately enterprise organizations don't care as much about those distinctions as they do about solving problems. On the issue of non-smart glass devices, clearly that's the much larger part of the market today. I only had the one slide of Lowe's showing with an iPad in their case. Haven't necessarily seen a need to create a sort of count for that. It is integrated into so much software that you could have an application for iPad that part of that application is using augmented reality. The user may not even understand that that's the case, so it would be hard to survey about it. And so what we look at is, a variety of fundamentals. There's a whole bunch of great software developers out there who are operating in this space. We look at the tools that they're using. We look at some of the applications on a per basis and sort of see, is this part of their value proposition, or is it just a feature of another app? So it's more complicated when you get to those horizontal devices.
Indeed, and you transitioned beautifully into the next question, which was, how else can we count enterprise augmented reality? How else than thinking of it only as the presentation system. So do you, Tom, you haven't, you're specifically on devices, but you must recognize that there are other ways of counting it. And what if one device is shared by 10 people? What do you do then?
Yeah, it's a great question, and while I'm focused on devices within IDC, we're looking at the broader infrastructure and the use cases, and I think fundamentally what we'll end up doing is trying to capture the amount of spend that an organization devotes towards AR, and that will run across a wide range of to JP's point, at first it's probably going to be primarily software, right? Software and services that are served up on existing devices. Over time, hardware will become part of that. But I think, fundamentally, it comes down to, figuring out those verticals where AR is gaining traction first, and then capturing how it's being used. Because I think in a lot of cases, you'll have people that are in an AR setting for much of their day. There will be plenty of people that move in and out of AR on a daily basis, and then there will be an even larger percentage of people that maybe tap into it once a week or a couple of times a month, depending on their the work situation. So simply pointing to the number of users, I think, quickly becomes not irrelevant, but not particularly useful in the same way that trying to point to the number of smartphones being used in a business, becomes challenging over time.
And not very useful. I mean,
Right.
fundamentally.
Right.
JP, do you have anything else you want to add as far as counting users, or what is a user?
Right. I just add one more piece about this, which is that the end user here, let's say on a workforce side, we actually survey workers. So we do quantitative studies of workers. It's a little tricky, though, to ask about something like this, because the definition isn't going to be widely understood by the workers themselves. So if you say, hey, are you using augmented reality, that's not going to mean a lot to the most people out there. So we have to look at scenarios to try to capture that. Over time, perhaps the term will become more commonplace and we'll be able to quantify it that way.
Or maybe we won't need to use the term at all. I remember when we first started using the term multimedia. Now you don't need to say it's a multimedia app, and it's quite common to just refer to something without saying it's mobile, because people assume.
Right. It's even like the term go online. I mean, do you have to really go online anymore, or are you sort of always online, right? So some of these terms will become part of the fabric of what we do, and maybe the vocabulary for AR will change at some point or go away altogether.
Good questions. There's one of the problems with having a lot of diversity of endpoints and devices that you guys have been mentioning is I, as an enterprise, wouldn't be able to produce content for each different version of the device. So I can't have one workflow be prepared or developed, customized for use on HoloLens and Google Glass or Vuzix M100. I mean, it's that's another
right.
pretty difficult problem.
Although I will say that there are companies like Apex Labs who offer applications that run across a variety of smart glass platforms, and therefore essentially they're trying to make that a little bit easier. Part of that is a recognition that these are pretty immature hardware platforms, and we don't know who will be around and who will win in the future. And part of it could be also that you may actually want to run more than one hardware platform in a really, really large organization, simply because the jobs that you're tailoring it to could be different. Right.
Diversity of jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and we can look at enterprise use of PCs, for example. Obviously, Microsoft and Windows, a dominant player there. for many, many years. In fact, our PC tracker for a lot of years didn't even think about the operating system, because it was sort of a foregone conclusion that 93–94% was going to be Windows. That's changing on PCs. Obviously, Mac OS 10 and Google Chrome becoming bigger players, and I think you'll see the major platform vendors similarly jockeying for position to own a share of AR. And I think the three major platform owners will each approach this in their sort of very unique way, right? Google doing what Google does, Microsoft what it does with Windows 10, and then Apple more behind closed doors. But I think right now there's a lot of repurposed middleware out there, a lot of baling wire and tape to get these things to work.
What about standards? What's one of the things that people that's one approach to supporting a more heterogeneous device environment, if they could at least support some basic specifications. Do you have any candidates for standards?
I think I think you're absolutely right, and I think that over time that becomes important. I think out of the gate you'll see each of these platform owners trying to outdo the others and build some momentum. I think Apple is potentially ends up playing from behind because of the nature of how Apple sort of approaches this type of stuff, where you have Google and Project Tango and lots of other stuff that I think is early days now and maybe experimental, but gets rolled into the platform later, and then maybe standards start to arise from that.
Okay, let's go to the next question. And I've been hearing about pilots, and I'm sure you've spoken with a lot of people who are doing pilots. Are we going to be in pilots forever, gentlemen? I mean, is that all we have today? Are there some production deployments and we just don't hear about them? Are they secret, top secret?
Oh, there's definitely production deployments. And again, if we start with the smartphone and tablet, there are many examples of that, and have been for years. In fact, one great example that I like is Mitsubishi Heating and Cooling. They are the vendors of those air conditioning systems that are central, but they have a unit inside your house as well as outside. It used to be that their salespeople would come to your home and they would walk in and you would say, well, how big is that going to be on my wall? And they would hold up their hands and they'd say, oh, it's about this big, not too big. That didn't really fly. People didn't really have a great understanding of how big the unit would be. So they worked with a company called Mateo, which was subsequently bought by Apple, as many of you probably know, on an augmented reality application for iPad. And what that did was allowed them to take a photo of you standing in front of your wall and superimpose a visual of exactly how large the internal air conditioning unit would look. As a result, they had better close rates. They had an increase in business outcomes. So that kind of stuff has been going on for years. I know of telcos and utilities companies and others who've done this with tablets for many years. When it comes to smart glasses, I would say we are at a more immature state of things, but you will find that there are some real-world examples that are out there. You could look, for example, at Epson Moverio, who both Tom and I mentioned. They have a really fun and interesting example of a B2B2C installation at the Brescia Museum in Italy, where instead of giving you an audio guide, you actually get the Epson Moverio smart glasses, and they're able to do some visual recognition to give you a smart glass experience as you walk through an archaeological site. So that's real, that's live, that's happening. I know museums all over the place are very interested in this. All of that said, most of the customers that I talk to, and I'm betting the same is true for Tom, especially on the smart glass side, are at the very early stages. I mean, we haven't even seen all of the market entrants with products yet, like Magic Leap, or we haven't seen what companies like Apple or HP or Dell or whomever, what are their plans in this space. So it's both real today, but it's also, there are an awful lot of pilots depending on the scenario.
Tom, do you see more pilots? Do you think that there are some hidden production projects that are
Uh,
getting a
I,
return on investment already? Too
I,
early?
I would tend, I would agree with JP that they're from a sort of purpose-built hardware perspective, not a lot. I do think that those proof of concept and pilots, uh, different from a lot of proof of concept and pilots over the years, that you will probably see actual ROI even on these modest deployments. And so I'm not seeing a ton of moving beyond pilot yet, aside from the examples that JP gave. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that even those products that are ostensibly shipping are still shipping in dev kit mode, or in very limited quantities. And to me, that's one of the things that I guess is worth mentioning is, as we try to forecast the head-mounted display market, you just can't take for granted how hard this is. We talked a little bit about virtual reality, and virtual reality is a fairly straightforward process where you're putting a screen in front of people's eyes and obscuring the rest of their vision. But when you're trying to create hardware that not only displays images in front of people's eyes, but also lets them see around, there's a lot of moving parts, and so the products are expensive, and the yields are low, and so I think it really does point to pilot mode for the near term.
I think it also depends on how you define it. That's what you guys are saying in a way. But in the automotive industry, which we know in Germany, they've been investing in augmented reality for, gosh, a long time, almost a decade. I believe that there are some projection augmented reality systems there that are in production. I've also heard in aviation and aerospace that it is being used in just say commercial environments when they're doing fitting and welding and drilling holes and putting in rivets, and those industries have been working on it significantly longer than others. Okay, last question then. What's going to make 2016 a great year for enterprise augmented reality? You don't have to share, like the top 10 things you think will happen, but we can talk about trends. What's going to happen that's special this year? JP.
Well, we're going to start out by seeing a lot of these hardware platforms come to more maturity. Of course, we expect to see HoloLens actually shipping to developers very, very soon, and we're going to, that'll be very helpful. So that'll be the build time frame at the end of this month. We're going to be seeing other releases of products. Presumably everybody in the market is iterating rapidly to make sure that the product they have out there. So a lot of this actually, on the smart glass side specifically, again, assuming that the tablet side is already fairly mature, on the smart glass side, we are in a need of getting more and more hardware, better hardware out there, and also seeing some of those innovations come into the wider market. I mean, after all, we've been talking about HoloLens for 14 months now. We've seen lots of demos. We've done some interesting things with it, but it's not generally available to any old enterprise who wants to get it for at least a few more weeks. So I think hardware-wise, we're going to be seeing some where does that all lead, and then you're going to start seeing just tons of stories. Oil and gas, as you referenced early on in this conversation, was actually one of the very first movers in the enterprise space here, but they've hit hard times because of the oil price, and that has really choked off some of the innovation that was going on there. So I think we're going to see champions emerge in other areas, probably field service, probably complex field service, and then maybe healthcare. And I think the storytelling and the wins, those lighthouse customers are going to be very important in driving the market forward.
Yeah, and I would say, I guess I would sound a note of caution around 2016. I think VR will get a lot of attention this year. Obviously, some big products shipping there. Um, the thing that gives me both hope and uh, for the long-term future of AR is that I think a lot of these hardware guys specifically are trying to be very cautious, and they're trying to um, under promise and over deliver and not ship before they're ready. And so I think 2016 from an AR perspective, JP's exactly right. You know, I've seen some excellent stories on AR in healthcare. As the dev kits for HoloLens gets out, you'll start to see more use cases, you know, in design and education and all these different things. And so we'll start to see the market wake up to the possibilities. But I think we need to be careful not to set too high an expectation for 2016 because I think this is going to be long. It's going to take a while. But at the end, it's going to have a very profound impact on enterprise, and so we need to we need to let the technology evolve at the right pace.
Right, because that's going to be critical to the cost points as well. These some of these displays and the optics are far too expensive in this low volume production, and
Exactly.
I every day I hear people say, you know, power consumption continues to be an enormously big problem. Uh, doesn't matter really if you're talking a light, small form factor or something more powerful. Uh, Power consumption remains an obstacle today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have gradually gone through, as we've been speaking, some of the questions that have been added by people from the audience. So I think we've largely gone through those, and those that we didn't answer, I'll take a moment to answer them separately and offline. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your participation, great insights, and a lot of the fantastic new things to come. We look forward to your releasing your reports and your studies and sharing those with your customers going forward. I hope that you'll be speaking about those trends and developments in public as well, and look forward to learning more about those as the year goes on.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Christine.
All right. So for those of you who are on the call, we'll be conducting another webinar May 18th. It will be talking about once you know your use cases, how do you then choose the best device for your project? So this is one of what we call our sort of tactical webinars for AR project managers. And we hope that many of you will join us for that. So thank you very much for attending and wishing you all a nice day. Bye-bye.